For centuries, whispers have echoed through history. Stories of the Knights Templar unearthing something beneath the ruins of Solomon's Temple. Not treasure, but knowledge. A discovery so profound it could rewrite the origins of both faith and power. The Church denied it, kings feared it, and those who knew the truth vanished without a trace. What was really hidden beneath the holy ground of Jerusalem? And why did the Vatican try so hard to bury it forever? In 1119, 9 French knights arrived in the Holy Land with a mission they claimed was simple: protect Christian pilgrims. But for 9 years they barely left their quarters above the Temple Mount, and the sounds of digging could be heard from below. When they finally emerged and returned to Europe, they were no longer poor knights. They had become the wealthiest, most powerful organization in Christendom. What they found beneath those ancient stones changed everything. This is the story the Church spent centuries trying to erase.
The year is 1119, and Jerusalem is a powder keg of religious tension. Just 20 years after the First Crusade captured the Holy City from Muslim control, the Christian kingdom established in the Levant is fragile, surrounded by enemies, and desperately in need of military protection. Into this volatile situation arrive 9 French nobles, knights who have taken religious vows and adopted a name that will echo through history: the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, the Knights Templar. Their leader is Hugues de Payens, a nobleman from the Champagne region of France. With him are Godfrey de Saint-Omer, André de Montbard, uncle to the future Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, and 6 other knights whose names history has barely preserved. They present themselves to King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with a proposal that seems, on the surface, perfectly reasonable. They wish to form a military order dedicated to protecting Christian pilgrims traveling the dangerous roads from the port of Jaffa to Jerusalem. King Baldwin, who desperately needs military support, welcomes them enthusiastically. But then he does something extraordinary, something that will fuel conspiracy theories for the next 9 centuries. He grants them quarters not in some peripheral garrison or border fortress where pilgrims actually need protection, but in the royal palace itself, in the Al-Aqsa Mosque that sits directly atop the ruins of Solomon's Temple. Think about that for a moment. 9 relatively unknown knights, claiming poverty as part of their order's name, are given accommodation in the holiest and most politically significant location in all of Jerusalem, not near the pilgrim roads they claim to protect, not in military outposts where threats actually exist, but in the sacred compound where, according to Jewish, Christian, and Islamic tradition, some of the most important events in religious history occurred. Why? The official history offers no satisfactory explanation. We're told that Baldwin was simply being generous, that the space was available, that perhaps he wanted these holy warriors close at hand. But the contemporary sources reveal something strange. For the next 9 years, nearly a decade, the Knights Templar barely recruit any new members. They remain a tiny organization of 9 to 12 men. They rarely venture out to actually protect pilgrims, which was supposedly their entire purpose for existing. Arab historians of the period, particularly the chronicler Al-Kalkashandi, mention something curious: sounds coming from beneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque, excavation sounds, the movement of stone on stone, digging that went on for years, always conducted in secret, always at night, always out of sight of the Muslim population who still had authority over much of the Temple Mount complex. What were they doing down there? In the 1860s, a British Royal Engineers survey team, led by Lieutenant Charles Warren, was given permission to conduct archaeological explorations beneath the Temple Mount. What they found confirmed the Arab accounts: a network of tunnels, clearly medieval in origin, based on the carving techniques and tool marks, extending deep beneath the ruins. These weren't ancient Jewish tunnels from Solomon's or Herod's time. They were Crusader-era excavations, systematic, purposeful. Someone had been searching for something specific. The tunnels connected to ancient cisterns and storage chambers that dated back to the original temple period. Some of these chambers had been sealed since before the Roman destruction in 70 AD, and based on the evidence Warren's team found, broken pottery, discarded tools, evidence of prolonged occupation, the medieval excavators had accessed these sealed chambers. They had found their way into spaces that had been hidden for over 1,000 years. But here's what's crucial to understand. The Templars weren't archaeologists conducting random exploration. Everything about their excavation suggests they knew exactly what they were looking for. They dug in specific locations. They accessed particular chambers. They were following some kind of blueprint or ancient text that told them where to dig and what they would find. Where did they get this information? One theory points to the Library of Alexandria. Before its destruction, it contained Jewish texts and historical records that detailed the temple's construction and what had been hidden within it before the Babylonian conquest. Some of these texts survived in copies scattered across the Mediterranean world. Perhaps the Templars or their sponsors back in France had access to such documents. Another possibility involves Jewish communities in Europe who had preserved oral traditions about the temple. The Talmud contains cryptic references to items hidden before the destruction, sealed in secret chambers known only to the highest priests. Perhaps the Templars made contact with Jewish scholars who shared this knowledge, hoping that Christians might succeed where Jews could not, in accessing the sealed chambers. Or perhaps, and this is the explanation that makes the Church's later persecution of the Templars make sense, they were guided by Christian texts that had been suppressed, documents that the early Church had declared heretical and tried to destroy, Gospels that didn't make it into the official Bible, letters that described the true nature of Jesus' ministry and what he actually taught about divinity, salvation, and the kingdom of heaven.
Whatever the source of their information, the Templars spent 9 years systematically excavating beneath the holiest ground in Jerusalem. 9 years of backbreaking labor, moving stone in secret, accessing chambers that had been sealed for millennia. And based on what happened next, based on their sudden explosive rise to power and wealth, they found what they were looking for. In 1128, 9 years after their arrival in Jerusalem, something dramatic happens. Euctopion returns to Europe, and suddenly the tiny, obscure order of 9 poor knights becomes the subject of the highest-level church attention. The Council of Troyes is convened, a major ecclesiastical gathering. Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential religious figures in Europe and nephew to Templar Knight André de Montbard, writes a ringing endorsement of the order titled "In Praise of the New Knighthood." The Pope himself, Honorius II, officially recognizes the Knights Templar and grants them extraordinary privileges. They are exempted from paying tithes to local churches. They are allowed to keep all treasure they find. Most remarkably, they answer to no authority except the Pope himself, not to kings, not to bishops, not to any earthly power. They become, essentially, an independent state within the structure of the Church. And then the donations start flowing. Nobles across Europe begin giving land, money, and resources to the Templars. Within just a few years, they establish commanderies, fortified compounds in France, England, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and across the Holy Land. They build castles that demonstrate engineering knowledge far advanced for the period. They create the first international banking system, allowing pilgrims to deposit money in one country and withdraw it in another using encrypted notes, a financial innovation that won't be fully understood by secular authorities for another 2 centuries. By 1150, barely 30 years after 9 poor knights arrived in Jerusalem, the Templars have become the wealthiest, most powerful organization in Christian Europe. They owned vast tracts of land. They have their own fleet of ships. They loan money to kings and finance crusades. They've created a network that spans the entire known world, operating according to their own laws, following their own agenda. How does this happen? How do 9 unknown knights become a global empire in just 3 decades? The official history says it was divine favor combined with effective organization and military prowess. They were successful because they were holy warriors doing God's work. But that explanation falls apart under scrutiny. Plenty of religious orders were formed during the Crusades. None of them achieved anything remotely close to the Templars' level of success. None of them received the extraordinary privileges the Templars enjoyed. None of them operated with the kind of independence and power that made secular rulers jealous and afraid. Something else was at work. Something that gave the Templars leverage over the church itself. Something that made popes grant them privileges that undermined episcopal authority across Europe. Something that made them untouchable for a while. The evidence suggests that what they found beneath Solomon's temple gave them knowledge and possibly physical artifacts that proved invaluable on multiple levels. On a practical level, they may have discovered ancient texts containing advanced knowledge, mathematics, engineering, astronomy, medicine that had been preserved from earlier civilizations. Knowledge that made them more effective as military engineers, architects, and administrators. But more importantly, and this is what ultimately led to their destruction, they found something that gave them power over the church's narrative itself. Something that challenged the theological foundations upon which papal authority rested. Something so dangerous that merely possessing it made them a threat that had to be eliminated. Because here's the crucial detail that most accounts gloss over. The Templars didn't just become wealthy. They became independent. They built their own churches, conducted their own ceremonies, developed their own traditions that didn't quite align with Orthodox Catholic practice. They were accused, later during their persecution, of secret rituals, unusual beliefs, and practices that suggested they had knowledge beyond standard Christian theology. Were these accusations simply fabrications designed to justify their persecution? Or were they based on something real? On rituals and beliefs the Templars had developed based on what they discovered beneath the temple. The trial transcripts, the confessions extracted under torture, the fevered accusations of heresy, all of it points to one conclusion. The Templars knew something. Something that made them powerful and eventually made them too dangerous to be allowed to survive. But what exactly did they find in those sealed chambers beneath Solomon's temple? What could possibly give a group of medieval knights enough leverage to challenge the church itself? What knowledge or artifacts could transform 9 poor knights into an organization that rivaled kingdoms? To answer that, we need to understand what Solomon's temple really was, not just the building described in the Bible, but what it represented in ancient Jewish mysticism, what secrets might have been sealed within it, and why those secrets would be devastating to the medieval church if they were ever revealed. Because the deeper you dig into the temple's history, the more you realize that it was never just a house of worship. It was something far more mysterious and far more dangerous.
To understand what the Templars might have discovered, we need to go back nearly 2,000 years before their excavations, back to the construction of Solomon's temple itself, and to the mysteries that were sealed within its foundations from the very beginning. The year is 957 BC. King Solomon, son of David, has inherited a united kingdom of Israel at the height of its power and prosperity. According to the biblical account in 1 Kings, God appears to Solomon in a dream and offers him anything he desires. Solomon asks not for wealth or military victory, but for wisdom, the ability to govern justly and understand the deepest truths of existence. God grants this request, and Solomon becomes legendary for a wisdom that supposedly surpassed all the sages of Egypt and the East. But here's what most people don't know.
Solomon's wisdom wasn't just philosophical or political. Ancient Jewish texts, the Talmud, the Kabbalah, and other mystical writings describe Solomon as a master of what they called the hidden sciences. He could speak with animals, command spirits, and understand the secret names of God that held power over the natural world. He possessed knowledge that came from sources far older than the Hebrew people themselves. Where did this knowledge come from? The Bible itself provides a clue. Solomon's father David had conquered Jerusalem, a city that had been inhabited for thousands of years before the Israelites arrived. It had been a Canaanite holy site, and before that, a place sacred to civilizations whose names have been lost to history. When Solomon chose to build the temple on Mount Moriah, he wasn't picking a random location. He was building on ground that had been considered holy, powerful for millennia. The temple's design, as described in 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles, is extraordinarily specific. God provides exact dimensions, materials, and architectural details. The Holy of Holies, the innermost chamber where only the high priest could enter once a year, was a perfect cube, 20 cubits in length, width, and height. It was covered entirely in gold and contained the Ark of the Covenant, flanked by two massive cherubim whose wings touched in the center. But here's what's fascinating. These dimensions and proportions aren't random. They encode mathematical ratios that appear throughout nature. The golden ratio, harmonic proportions found in music and astronomy. The temple was designed according to principles of sacred geometry that wouldn't be discovered by Greek mathematicians until centuries later. It was built as a three-dimensional representation of cosmic order, a structure that resonated with the fundamental frequencies of creation itself. Ancient texts describe the temple as more than just a place of worship. It was a device, a mechanism for connecting the earthly and divine realms. The Ark of the Covenant, housed in the Holy of Holies, was described as emanating a power so intense that touching it could kill a man instantly. During certain ceremonies, priests reported experiencing phenomena that sound remarkably like electrical discharges, sparks, a humming sound, a sense of tremendous energy contained within that golden cube. What was actually happening in Solomon's temple? Modern researchers examining the biblical descriptions have noted something remarkable. The ark's construction, gold-plated acacia wood with a solid gold crown, closely resembles the design of a Leyden jar, an early form of electrical capacitor. The temple's placement on a high point, its bronze pillars, the specific materials used in its construction, all of these suggest a structure designed to accumulate and channel some form of energy. Was the temple simply a beautiful building for religious ceremonies? Or was it something more? A technology disguised as theology, built according to knowledge that Solomon had inherited from civilizations that preceded Israel by thousands of years? Ancient texts preserve hints of what this knowledge might have been. The Kabbalah speaks of the temple as containing the foundation stone, the rock from which all creation emanated, the point where heaven and earth connect. Beneath this stone, according to legend, was a chamber containing secrets that dated back to the beginning of the world. Secrets that, if revealed, would fundamentally change humanity's understanding of existence itself. When the Babylonians destroyed the first temple in 587 BC, something crucial disappeared. The Ark of the Covenant was never seen again. Its fate remains one of history's enduring mysteries. But here's the question that haunts biblical scholars. Could the Babylonians, who were ruthlessly efficient in their conquest, really have missed the most valuable object in the entire temple? Or is it more likely that the Jewish priests, seeing the inevitable conquest approaching, hid it? Ancient sources suggest exactly that. The Babylonian Talmud contains cryptic references to items from the temple being concealed in secret chambers and hidden spaces before the destruction. Some texts mention the prophet Jeremiah removing sacred objects and sealing them in a cave. Others describe priests creating an elaborate system of underground chambers where the temple's most important treasures and its most dangerous secrets were hidden away. When the Second Temple was built 70 years later, after the Jews returned from Babylonian captivity, something fundamental had changed. The Holy of Holies was empty. No ark, no physical manifestation of God's presence, just an empty cube covered in gold, a placeholder for something that was gone. The priests performed the same ceremonies, but everyone knew the power that had once resided in the temple, whatever it really was, had vanished. Fast forward to Jesus' time. The Second Temple, massively expanded by Herod the Great, stands as one of the wonders of the ancient world. Jesus himself walked its courtyards, taught in its precincts, and, according to the Gospels, drove out the money changers in a rage, declaring that they had turned his Father's house into a den of thieves. But he also said something more ominous. "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Gospel of John tells us Jesus was speaking about his own body, about his death and resurrection. But what if there was a deeper meaning? What if Jesus, who demonstrated knowledge and abilities that seemed supernatural to his followers, had access to the same ancient wisdom that Solomon possessed? What if he knew about the secrets sealed beneath the temple and understood that his mission was connected to that hidden knowledge?
When the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in 70 AD, they were even more thorough than the Babylonians. They dismantled it stone by stone, burned what would burn, and attempted to erase Jerusalem as a Jewish city entirely. But again, there's a crucial question. Did they find everything? Or did the priests, seeing Roman siege engines approaching, hide the most important items and documents in the same secret chambers that had protected them from Babylon? Early Christian texts, many of which didn't make it into the official Bible, contain intriguing hints. The Gospel of Thomas, discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, presents Jesus teaching secret wisdom to his inner circle, knowledge not meant for public proclamation, but reserved for those ready to understand. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene describes Jesus revealing hidden mysteries that the other apostles struggled to accept. These suppressed texts suggest that early Christianity contained esoteric teachings, a hidden layer of meaning beneath the public message. The early church fathers, men like Origen, Clement of Alexandria, and Tertullian, speak openly about Christianity having two levels: the simple faith taught to the masses, and deeper mysteries revealed only to the initiated. They reference secret teachings, hidden knowledge, wisdom traditions inherited from the apostles that weren't written in the canonical Gospels. But then, something changed. In 325 AD, the Council of Nicaea, convened by Emperor Constantine, standardized Christian doctrine. Alternative interpretations were declared heretical. Books that didn't support the Orthodox narrative were banned and burned. The Church transformed from a diverse movement with multiple perspectives into a rigidly hierarchical institution with one official truth. Why? What was the Church trying to suppress? What alternative understanding of Jesus' teachings was so dangerous that it had to be systematically eliminated? This brings us back to Solomon's temple and what might have been hidden beneath it. Imagine that in those sealed chambers, protected from Babylonian and Roman destruction, certain items survived. Texts describing the true nature of Jesus' ministry, documents that contradicted the official church narrative, perhaps even artifacts that demonstrated the temple's original purpose as something other than what medieval theology claimed. Now imagine that the Knights Templar, guided by suppressed texts or insider knowledge, found those chambers. Imagine they discovered documents written by the temple priests before the Babylonian conquest, describing exactly what the temple was and what knowledge Solomon possessed. Imagine they found evidence that the power once contained in the Holy of Holies was not what the Church taught, not the presence of a distant authoritarian God demanding absolute obedience,
but something else entirely. Something that suggested divinity was accessible, that the separation between human and divine was not as absolute as church doctrine insisted. This would explain everything that followed. Why the Knights Templar received such extraordinary privileges from the church. Because they possessed knowledge that could undermine papal authority entirely. And the church needed to keep them close, keep them controlled. Why they became so wealthy and powerful so quickly? Because ancient wisdom, whether technological or spiritual, gave them practical advantages in everything from architecture to finance. Why they had to be destroyed? Because knowledge that challenges power structures can only be tolerated for so long before it becomes too dangerous to allow it to exist. But what specifically might they have found? The possibilities are staggering and deeply unsettling to Orthodox theology. Ancient mathematical and astronomical knowledge that would make them superior engineers and navigators. Medical texts describing healing techniques. Alchemical formulas for creating materials and substances. Architectural principles that explained how to build structures of impossible scale and precision. And most dangerous of all, religious texts. Documents that described the true nature of Solomon's wisdom. Gospels that didn't make the official cut. Letters from Jesus' original followers describing what he actually taught before his message was edited and sanitized by church authorities. Evidence that the Christian story as told by Rome wasn't the complete truth, or wasn't the truth at all. Contemporary accounts from the Crusader period mention strange artifacts in Templar possession, objects that never appeared in official inventories, items that were carefully guarded, transported under extreme security, and never displayed publicly. The Templars themselves, in documents that survived, reference the treasure in ways that suggest it wasn't simply gold or jewels. They speak of knowledge, understanding, mysteries that had been revealed to them. The persecution of the Templars, when it came in 1307, focused heavily on accusations of heresy, denying Christ, worshiping strange idols, conducting secret ceremonies. Under torture, some Templars confessed to spitting on the cross, to revering a mysterious head called Baphomet, to beliefs and practices that contradicted church teaching. Were these confessions simply lies extracted through pain, or did they reflect, however distortedly, real Templar practices based on knowledge they had acquired beneath Solomon's temple? The famous head of Baphomet that the Templars allegedly worshipped has never been satisfactorily explained. Some scholars suggest it was a corruption of Muhammad, implying Muslim sympathies. Others propose it represents a Gnostic deity or ancient pagan symbol. But what if it was simpler than that? What if Baphomet referred not to an idol, but to knowledge itself? Wisdom preserved from Solomon's time, understanding of mysteries that the church had spent centuries suppressing. Because ultimately, the greatest threat to institutional power isn't military force or economic competition. It's knowledge. Information that allows people to question the official narrative, to see that reality might be different than what they've been told. The Templars possessed such knowledge. It made them powerful, and it made their destruction inevitable.
For 9 long years, the sounds echoed beneath the Temple Mount. The scrape of metal on stone, the crack of rock splitting under pressure, the muffled voices of men working in darkness, guided only by torchlight and an ancient purpose that drove them deeper into the earth with each passing month. Imagine the scene. 9 nights, men trained for battle in the open air, spending their days and nights in cramped underground passages. They're not protecting pilgrims. That was never the real mission. They're excavating, following a plan so precise it suggests they knew exactly where to dig. But how? What map or manuscript guided them through the labyrinth beneath Jerusalem? The contemporary sources that mention the Templars' early years in Jerusalem are frustratingly brief. The official chronicles, written by monks and scribes loyal to the church, describe their establishment, their noble purpose, their growing reputation. But they say almost nothing about what the Knights actually did during those first 9 years.
It's as if there was a deliberate silence, a collective agreement not to look too closely at what was happening beneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque. But the Arab historians weren't so careful. Al-Kalkashandi, writing in the 14th century, but drawing on earlier sources, mentions strange activity around the Temple Mount during the early Crusader period. He describes Christian knights who spent years seeking treasure beneath the noble sanctuary, working in secret, bribing guards to look the other way, and creating passages that connected to ancient chambers below. The physical evidence supports this. When Lieutenant Charles Warren conducted his survey in the 1860s, he found those medieval tunnels and immediately recognized them as systematic excavation work. These weren't random explorations. The tunnels targeted specific locations, moved in deliberate directions, and showed evidence of careful planning. Warren's team found broken pottery that dated to the Crusader period, iron tools bearing marks consistent with 12th century European manufacture, and, most tellingly, evidence that the excavators had successfully breached ancient sealed chambers. But here's what makes the Templar excavation remarkable. They found their targets. Modern archaeologists, with ground-penetrating radar, detailed surveys, and centuries of accumulated knowledge, still struggle to fully map the chambers beneath the Temple Mount. Political sensitivities make comprehensive excavation impossible. The site is sacred to 3 religions, and any digging risks international incident. Yet somehow, 9 medieval knights with primitive tools managed to locate and access chambers that had been sealed for over 1,000 years. This suggests they had guidance, detailed guidance, a text or map that described exactly what lay beneath the temple and where it could be found. But where would such a document come from? One possibility lies in the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in caves near Qumran in 1947. Among these ancient Jewish texts, archaeologists found the Copper Scroll, a unique document inscribed on copper sheets rather than parchment, listing locations of hidden treasure throughout Jerusalem and the surrounding area. The scroll describes 64 different hiding places, giving precise directions using ancient landmarks, and mentioning unimaginable quantities of gold, silver, and sacred objects. Most scholars dismiss the Copper Scroll as either wildly exaggerated or referring to treasure that was recovered long ago. But what if copies of similar documents existed in medieval Europe? What if Jewish communities, scattered across the Mediterranean after the Roman destruction of Jerusalem, preserved not just religious texts, but practical information about what had been hidden before the temple fell? What if the Templars, or their sponsors, had access to such documents? Another possibility involves the Library of Alexandria. Before its destruction, this great library contained copies of texts from across the known world, including Jewish historical and mystical writings. When the library burned, some texts were rescued, copied, and distributed to smaller libraries and private collections throughout the Byzantine Empire and beyond. Perhaps among these salvaged works were detailed accounts of the temple's construction, descriptions of what Solomon had sealed within it, even architectural plans showing the hidden chambers beneath. Or perhaps, and this is the explanation that makes church authorities most nervous, the Templars were guided by Christian texts that had been suppressed. The early church, as it standardized doctrine and eliminated alternatives, declared many writings heretical and ordered them destroyed. But books have a way of surviving, hidden in private libraries, copied in secret by scribes who believed the knowledge too valuable to lose. If such texts describe Jesus' own knowledge of the temple secrets, if they mention him accessing those hidden chambers or teaching his disciples about what Solomon had hidden there, then those documents would tell the Templars exactly where to dig. Regardless of the source, the Templars clearly had excellent intelligence.
And based on what happened when they returned to Europe, the sudden wealth, the architectural knowledge, the banking innovations, the theological peculiarities, they found something extraordinary. The excavation itself would have been brutal work. The Temple Mount is built on bedrock, with chambers carved directly into living stone. The ancient builders had created a complex of cisterns, storage rooms, and secret spaces, some dating back to Solomon's original construction in the 10th century BC. Accessing these spaces meant moving tons of rubble from the Roman destruction, breaking through walls that had been deliberately sealed, and navigating passages that had been collapsed or flooded over the centuries. The Templars worked in secret, which meant they couldn't bring in large work crews or use obvious excavation techniques. Everything had to be done quietly, at night, with the minimum number of people who knew what was really happening. They would enter through the Al-Aqsa Mosque, their official headquarters, descend into the known cisterns and passages beneath it, and from there, access the older sealed chambers that lay deeper still. They would need light, torches or oil lamps that consumed precious oxygen in the confined spaces. They would need tools, iron bars for prying, hammers and chisels for breaking through stone, ropes to descend into chambers accessed through narrow shafts. And they would need pumps or buckets to remove water from flooded areas. And they would need absolute secrecy, because if the local Muslim authorities realized the extent of their excavation, diplomatic complications would have ended their mission immediately.
So what exactly did they find down there in the darkness? The trial records from 1307, when the Templars were arrested and interrogated, provide tantalizing hints. Under torture, knights confessed to possessing strange idols, mysterious heads, and objects of great power. They spoke of ceremonies involving these artifacts, of knowledge that had been passed down from the original 9 founders, of secrets that could only be shared among the initiated. Were these confessions reliable? Torture produces whatever answers the interrogators want to hear, so we must be skeptical. But even accounting for exaggeration and fabrication, certain consistent details emerge. The Templars possessed objects they considered sacred, but which were distinctly un-Christian. They had knowledge, architectural, mathematical, astronomical, that exceeded what was commonly available in medieval Europe. They practiced rituals that, while they claimed were orthodox, made church authorities deeply uncomfortable. The most persistent rumor involves texts. Multiple sources mention the Templars discovering ancient scrolls or books beneath the temple. These weren't biblical texts. The Templars had access to those already. These were something else. Documents that described the temple's true purpose. Writings that explained Solomon's wisdom in practical terms. Perhaps even gospels or letters from Jesus' time that contradicted the official church version of his life and teachings. Imagine you're a Templar knight, descended into a chamber that hasn't been opened since before Christ walked the earth. Your torch illuminates walls carved with strange symbols, not the Hebrew script you might expect, but older markings, perhaps Egyptian or something even more ancient. In niches carved into the stone walls, you find sealed containers, clay jars, bronze boxes, objects wrapped in deteriorated fabric that crumbles at your touch. You open one container, and inside are scrolls. The writing is Hebrew, but Old Hebrew, the script used before the Babylonian captivity. Your companion, one of the few literate members of your order, begins to read. And what he reads makes your blood run cold. Because these aren't religious texts praising God and describing rituals. These are technical documents, plans, instructions, formulas for creating materials, descriptions of building techniques, mathematical principles for calculating astronomical events, medical procedures for healing diseases. This is Solomon's wisdom, not metaphorical wisdom about being just and righteous,
but actual practical knowledge accumulated from civilizations that preceded Israel. The kind of knowledge that built the pyramids, that allowed ancient cultures to create monuments and artifacts that still puzzle modern engineers, that was systematically suppressed by later civilizations because knowledge is power, and those who control knowledge control society. In another chamber, you find something even more disturbing. Texts written in Greek dating to the 1st century AD. Letters between early Christian communities describing Jesus' teachings in ways that don't quite match what the church has told you. References to hidden wisdom and secret knowledge that Jesus shared only with his closest disciples. Descriptions of practices, meditation techniques, ritual methods that sound nothing like the Christianity you've been taught. And finally, in the deepest chamber, accessed through a passage so narrow you have to crawl, you find objects, the artifacts that will become both the Templars' greatest treasure and their ultimate doom. Not the Ark of the Covenant, that's long gone, if it ever existed in the form the Bible describes, but other items, ceremonial objects from the temple, perhaps including tools and instruments used by the high priests. Items made of gold and precious materials, yes, but more importantly, items whose function and purpose suggest the temple ceremonies were about something other than what medieval theology claims. Perhaps you find evidence of what the cherubim on the ark really were. Not angelic beings, but technical components. Golden figures whose outstretched wings created an electrical circuit, a capacitor that accumulated charge from the specific atmospheric conditions on the Temple Mount. You might find the breastplate of judgment worn by the high priest, described in Exodus as containing 12 precious stones, and discover that these stones, arranged in a specific geometric pattern, created an optical device, something that allowed the wearer to perceive things invisible to normal sight. Or perhaps, and this is the possibility that terrified Rome, you find texts describing what Jesus actually did during his ministry. Not just healing and teaching, but demonstrating techniques, sharing practices, revealing knowledge that suggested the divine realm wasn't distant and separate, but accessible to anyone who learned the correct methods. Evidence that salvation wasn't something granted by institutional authority, but an internal transformation anyone could achieve, which would make the Church's claim to be the sole mediator between humanity and God completely unnecessary. Whatever the Templars found, it was enough to transform them. When they emerged from those chambers after 9 years of excavation, they weren't the same men who had gone down. They had knowledge, they had artifacts, and they had something even more dangerous. They had proof that the official history was incomplete at best, deliberately false at worst. The journey back to Europe must have been tense, traveling with crates of ancient documents and mysterious objects, knowing that if anyone discovered what they carried, the consequences would be severe. They couldn't simply declare what they'd found. That would invite immediate suppression. They needed to be subtle, strategic. They needed to reveal their discovery in ways that would make them powerful enough to protect themselves while not being so obvious that the Church would move against them immediately. So they did something brilliant. They offered the Church a partnership. They presented some of their discoveries, the ones that were impressive but not threatening. They demonstrated knowledge that made them valuable as military engineers and financial administrators. They shared enough to gain privileges and protection while keeping the truly dangerous secrets within their inner circles. For nearly 2 centuries, this strategy worked. The Templars became indispensable. They built castles and cathedrals. They financed crusades and royal projects. They created banking systems that medieval Europe desperately needed. They made themselves so useful, so embedded in the power structures of Christendom, that destroying them seemed impossible. But they had underestimated how deeply institutional power fears knowledge it cannot control. They had underestimated how dangerous it is to possess secrets that challenge the foundations of religious authority. And they had underestimated how ruthlessly the Church would act when it finally decided that the Templars knew too much to be allowed to survive. The countdown to their destruction had begun the moment they emerged from those chambers beneath the Temple Mount. It would just take 2 centuries for the consequences to arrive.
In 1128, Hugues de Payens stepped off a ship in France, carrying something far more valuable than gold. After 9 years in Jerusalem, after 9 years of excavation beneath the holiest ground in Christendom, he returned to Europe with knowledge that would transform his obscure order of 9 knights into the most powerful organization in the medieval world. The transformation was immediate and extraordinary. Within months of his return, Hugues was summoned to the Council of Troyes, a major ecclesiastical gathering convened specifically to discuss the Knights Templar. Think about that for a moment. The Catholic Church, which typically moved at a glacial pace, which required years of deliberation for even minor decisions, suddenly convened a high-level council to officially recognize an order that consisted of fewer than a dozen members. Why the rush? What had changed? At the Council of Troyes, something remarkable happened. Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential religious figures in Europe, a man whose words carried enormous weight with both the Pope and the crowned heads of Europe, stood before the assembled bishops and delivered a passionate endorsement of the Templars. His treatise, In Praise of the New Knighthood, described them as the perfect fusion of monastic piety and military valor, a new kind of warrior monk who would be the salvation of the Holy Land. But here's the crucial detail. Bernard of Clairvaux was André de Montbard's nephew. André de Montbard was one of the original 9 Templar knights. Bernard wasn't an objective observer praising an impressive organization. He was family, promoting his uncle's enterprise. And he was doing so with an enthusiasm that suggests he knew something about what they'd discovered. Something that convinced him the Templars deserved immediate and extraordinary support. The Council granted the Templars official recognition and privileges that were unprecedented for such a young organization. They were exempted from paying tithes to local churches, meaning they could keep all their wealth. They were allowed to build their own oratories and have their own chaplains, giving them religious independence from local bishops. Most remarkably, they were placed under the direct authority of the Pope alone, answering to no secular or religious authority except the Vatican itself. These weren't normal privileges for a military order. These were the rights of a sovereign entity, a state within the Church. And they came with a guarantee. The Templars could keep their discoveries secret, would share selected knowledge with the Church, would serve as the military and financial arm of Christendom. In exchange, they would receive protection, privileges, and the freedom to operate according to their own rules, as long as they didn't reveal too much about what they'd really found in Jerusalem. The donations began immediately. Nobles across Europe, encouraged by Bernard of Clairvaux's endorsement and by papal blessing, began giving land and money to the Templars. But here's what's strange. The rate of donation was extraordinary. Within just 30 years of their official recognition, the Templars owned properties in nearly every Christian kingdom in Europe. Massive estates, entire villages, fortified castles, a fleet of ships, agricultural lands that made them one of the largest landowners on the continent. How did they manage this wealth so effectively? The answer reveals another aspect of what they'd discovered in Jerusalem: practical knowledge. The Templars demonstrated abilities that seemed almost miraculous to their contemporaries. They built castles using architectural techniques that shouldn't have been possible with 12th century European knowledge.
Their fortifications incorporated principles of geometry and engineering that wouldn't be discovered by European scholars for another 100 years. Their most famous fortress, Chateau Pellerin in the Holy Land, was considered impregnable. Built on a rocky promontory jutting into the Mediterranean, it featured walls of such massive thickness and precise construction that even after the fall of the Crusader kingdoms, the fortress had to be abandoned rather than captured. No army could breach its defenses. The engineering knowledge required to build such structures suggests the Templars had access to architectural texts from ancient civilizations that understood these principles far better than medieval Europe did. But their most revolutionary innovation was financial. The Templars created the first international banking system, allowing pilgrims and merchants to deposit money at one Templar house and withdraw it at another, hundreds or thousands of miles away, using only an encrypted note as proof of their deposit. This required several breakthroughs: a secure system of written communication, trustworthy representatives in every major city, mathematical methods for tracking accounts, and, most remarkably, a form of encryption that kept these financial records secure from thieves and rival organizations. Where did medieval knights learn encryption? The official history suggests they developed it through trial and error, practical necessity driving innovation. But the system they used was sophisticated, employing substitution ciphers and code words that wouldn't be broken until modern cryptanalysis was developed. It's far more likely they were applying knowledge found in ancient texts, perhaps documents from Solomon's time, when Hebrew scholars were already expert in gematria and other forms of coded writing, or from even older sources describing cryptographic methods used in ancient diplomatic and commercial correspondence.
The Templars also demonstrated remarkable knowledge of navigation and geography. Their fleet of ships traveled routes across the Mediterranean and even into the Atlantic with unusual accuracy. They established trade networks that connected Europe to the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. Some researchers have suggested their ships may have reached the Americas decades or even centuries before Columbus, a claim that sounds absurd until you consider that if they possessed ancient navigational texts, they might have had access to knowledge of Atlantic currents and distant lands that European civilization had forgotten. But perhaps most tellingly, the Templars became bankers to kings. They loaned enormous sums to monarchs across Europe, financing wars and building projects, managing royal treasuries, serving as trusted financial advisors to the most powerful men in Christendom. This required not just wealth, but financial expertise, understanding of interest, risk assessment, currency exchange, and economic principles that were supposedly unknown in medieval Europe. Where did this financial knowledge come from? Again, the official answer is that they learned by doing, that practical experience taught them these skills. But the sophistication of their methods suggests something else. They had texts, perhaps from Babylonian or Egyptian sources, that described advanced banking and commercial practices from ancient civilizations. The Babylonians, 2,000 years before Christ, had developed sophisticated banking systems. The Phoenicians had created trade networks spanning the known world. If the Templars found documents describing these ancient economic systems, they could have adapted those principles to medieval European conditions, giving them advantages their contemporaries couldn't match. And then there's the matter of their religious practices. As the Templars grew in power, rumors began to circulate about their private ceremonies. They held meetings in locked rooms, admitting only initiated members. They conducted rituals that didn't quite align with standard Catholic practice. When new members were inducted, the ceremonies were secret, and those who participated were sworn to absolute silence about what occurred. Were these simply the normal mysteries of any fraternal organization? Or were they practicing rituals based on knowledge they discovered beneath the temple, perhaps ceremonies that actually dated back to Solomon's time, or even earlier. The trial transcripts from 1307 contain accusations that the Templars worshipped strange idols, denied Christ, and practiced forms of worship that were distinctly non-Christian. While most historians dismiss these accusations as fabricated to justify the persecution, some details are consistent enough across multiple testimonies to suggest there might have been something to them. The most famous accusation involves the head of Baphomet, a mysterious idol the Templars allegedly revered. Descriptions vary wildly. Some say it was a bearded male head, others a head with 3 faces. Still others describe it as both male and female. Some testimonies claim it was wood, others silver or gold. Some say it was an actual severed head preserved through unknown means. What was this head? Scholars have proposed dozens of theories. Some suggest Baphomet is a corruption of Mahu, implying the Templars had adopted Muslim beliefs. Others propose it represents a Gnostic deity or ancient pagan symbol. But what if it was simpler? What if the head referred to knowledge itself, specifically the secret wisdom they'd found beneath Solomon's temple? In Hebrew mysticism, the head often symbolizes wisdom or understanding. Perhaps worshipping the head simply meant revering the ancient knowledge they'd discovered, knowledge they believed was more profound than what the Church taught. By 1200, less than a century after their founding, the Templars had become essential to the functioning of medieval Christendom. They were the primary military defenders of the Crusader kingdoms. They provided banking services that made long-distance trade and travel possible. They built infrastructure, roads, bridges, fortifications across Europe and the Holy Land. They employed thousands of people and controlled vast economic resources. But they had also become dangerously independent. They answered only to the Pope, not to kings or bishops. They had their own fleet, their own estates, their own economic system. They possessed knowledge that gave them practical advantages in engineering, finance, and organization. And they held secrets about what they'd found beneath the temple, about alternative religious practices, about knowledge that challenged the Church's official narrative. Kings began to fear them because they were powerful enough to influence succession disputes and political conflicts. Bishops resented them because they operated outside normal ecclesiastical authority. Rival military orders were jealous of their privileges and wealth, and the Church hierarchy grew increasingly nervous about what the Templars really knew, what they might reveal if they ever chose to break their silence. The Templars had become too successful, too powerful, too independent, and in medieval Europe, that was the most dangerous thing you could be. Because when you possess knowledge that threatens the established order, when you demonstrate abilities that seem to bypass normal human limitations, when you operate with a level of independence that challenges institutional control, you become a problem that must be solved. For nearly 2 centuries, the balance held. The Templars remained useful enough, loyal enough, careful enough to avoid provoking a direct confrontation. They shared some of their knowledge with the Church, kept the most dangerous secrets hidden, and maintained the fiction that they were simply a military religious order serving Christendom's interests. But beneath the surface, tensions were building. The Crusader kingdoms were collapsing. The Templars' military purpose was becoming obsolete. Their financial power was making kings desperate, particularly King Philip IV of France, who had borrowed so heavily from the Templars that he was essentially bankrupt. And their secrets, those carefully guarded mysteries about what they'd found beneath Solomon's temple, were becoming harder to keep as the order grew larger and more diverse. The stage was being set for catastrophe. And when it came, it would come with stunning speed and brutality, designed to destroy not just the Templars themselves, but every trace of what they discovered, every hint of the knowledge that had made them so dangerous. Because the greatest threat to power isn't rebellion or military force, it's knowledge, information that allows people to question, to see alternatives, to imagine different ways of organizing society and understanding reality. The Templars possessed such knowledge, and for that they would pay the ultimate price.
By the late 13th century, the Knights Templar had become something the medieval world had never seen before, an organization that operated across borders, answered to no king, controlled vast wealth, and possessed knowledge that made them simultaneously indispensable and terrifying to the established powers of Christendom. But their success was creating enemies, and nowhere were those enemies more dangerous than within the very institution that had initially granted them protection, the Catholic Church. The problem wasn't simply that the Templars were wealthy and powerful. The Church had dealt with wealthy, powerful organizations before. The issue was something far more disturbing. The Templars were showing signs of independence that suggested they possessed knowledge the Church didn't control. And in an age when the Church's authority rested on its claim to be the sole mediator between humanity and God, the sole interpreter of divine will, that independence was intolerable. The first warning signs appeared in their architecture. As the Templars built churches and commanderies across Europe, they consistently incorporated design elements that seemed strange, even heretical, to Orthodox observers. Their churches featured proportions and geometric patterns that didn't match standard Catholic architecture. They included symbols, pentagrams, hexagrams, unusual astronomical alignments that suggested knowledge of mathematical and mystical principles outside normal church teaching. The famous Templar churches built in circular designs, like the Temple Church in London, were supposedly modeled on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. But they also echoed much older structures, ancient temples that predated Christianity by thousands of years. Their proportions embodied sacred geometry, mathematical ratios that appeared throughout nature and the cosmos. The golden ratio, harmonic proportions found in music, astronomical alignments that marked solstices and equinoxes. Where did medieval knights learn these principles? The Church's official scholars didn't possess this knowledge. The universities of Paris and Oxford were just beginning to rediscover ancient Greek mathematics through Arabic translations. Yet the Templars were building structures that demonstrated practical application of advanced geometric and astronomical knowledge, as if they had access to texts that described these principles directly. The church authorities noticed. Bishops visiting Templar properties reported feeling uncomfortable in their churches, sensing something not quite orthodox in their design and decoration. Dominican inquisitors, trained to detect heresy, observed that Templar ceremonies sometimes deviated from standard Catholic practice. The order was developing its own traditions, its own interpretations of sacred symbolism, its own understanding of sacred space. This might have been tolerable if the Templars had remained simply a military order focused on defending the Holy Land. But by 1291, when the last Crusader stronghold of Acre fell to Muslim forces, the Templars' military purpose had essentially ended. They still maintained a presence in Cyprus and other Mediterranean islands, but their role as defenders of Outremer, the Crusader states, was finished. Yet they showed no signs of disbanding. Instead, they shifted focus to their financial and agricultural operations in Europe. Their banking network expanded, their estates became more productive, their wealth continued to grow. And this raised an uncomfortable question. If they were no longer serving their original military purpose, why did they still need to exist? What was their real reason for maintaining such a powerful, independent organization? The Vatican had its suspicions. Reports from papal informants suggested the Templars were conducting research, studying ancient texts, pursuing knowledge that went far beyond what was appropriate for a religious military order. They were collecting manuscripts in languages most medieval scholars couldn't read: Hebrew, Arabic, Greek, even texts and scripts no one could identify. They were consulting with Jewish scholars about Kabbalistic mysteries. They were in communication with Muslim Sufis about esoteric interpretations of sacred texts.
Most disturbing of all, they seemed to be making connections, drawing parallels between different religious traditions.
suggesting that perhaps Christianity, Judaism, and Islam all contained fragments of older, deeper truths. This was dangerous thinking. The Church's authority rested on the claim that Christianity represented the complete and final revelation of God's will. Any suggestion that there were other paths to divine wisdom, that ancient pre-Christian traditions might contain valid spiritual knowledge, threatened the entire theological structure that kept the Church in power. Pope Boniface VIII, ruling at the end of the 13th century, began receiving detailed reports about Templar activities from his intelligence network. These reports painted a troubling picture. The Templars were said to possess objects, artifacts from Jerusalem, that they guarded with extreme secrecy. They conducted initiation ceremonies behind locked doors, making new members swear oaths of absolute silence about what they witnessed. During these initiations, some reports claimed, candidates were shown things that challenged their Christian faith, forced to perform acts that seemed blasphemous, and told secrets about the true nature of Jesus' ministry that contradicted church teaching. Were these reports accurate, or were they the paranoid fantasies of an institution that feared what it couldn't control? It's difficult to know, but the consistency of certain details across multiple sources suggests there was something real beneath the accusations. The Templars were practicing something, conducting some form of ceremony, preserving some tradition that didn't align with Orthodox Catholicism. The most persistent rumor involved their private chapels. Templars were known to spend hours in prayer within their own oratories, separate from the public masses conducted in their churches. What were they doing during those long hours? Standard devotions or something else? Some reports claimed they were practicing meditation techniques learned from Eastern traditions, methods for achieving altered states of consciousness, for experiencing direct spiritual insights without need for priestly mediation. If true, this was heresy of the highest order. The Church's entire power structure depended on the idea that salvation required institutional intermediation, that only through the sacraments administered by ordained priests could souls reach heaven. If the Templars had discovered practices that allowed individuals to achieve spiritual experiences directly, to access divine wisdom without church mediation, it would undermine the fundamental justification for ecclesiastical authority. There's evidence this is exactly what they'd found. Ancient Jewish mysticism, the Kabbalah, contained techniques for meditation and spiritual ascent that predated Christianity. Gnostic traditions, suppressed by the early church, taught that divine knowledge could be directly experienced rather than simply believed on faith. Eastern Christian monasticism, particularly in Egypt and Syria, preserved meditation practices that the Western Church had largely forgotten. If the Templars had discovered texts describing these methods, if they'd found evidence that Jesus himself taught such techniques to his inner circle, they would possess knowledge that was simultaneously invaluable and catastrophically dangerous. The church hierarchy faced a terrible dilemma. They couldn't simply demand the Templars reveal their secrets. That would publicly acknowledge that the Templars possessed knowledge the church didn't control, undermining papal authority. They couldn't suppress the order through normal ecclesiastical channels. The Templars answered only to the Pope, and forcing a direct confrontation would risk exposure of whatever secrets motivated the conflict. So they waited. They watched. They gathered intelligence, and they began to plan for the possibility that the Templars might need to be eliminated entirely, not through normal legal processes, but through a coordinated strike that would destroy the order before its members could reveal what they knew. The opportunity came from an unexpected direction: the desperate financial situation of King Philip IV of France.
And he owed enormous sums to the Knights Templar. The Templars had essentially served as his royal bankers, financing his wars and operations with loans that he had no realistic way to repay. The Templar treasury in Paris was fuller than the royal treasury. The Templars were, in practical terms, wealthier and more financially stable than the King of France himself. Philip needed a solution, and the Church needed to deal with the Templar problem. The convergence of interests was obvious. If Philip could be convinced to move against the Templars, to arrest them and confiscate their property, he would solve his financial crisis, while the Church eliminated an organization that possessed dangerous knowledge. All they needed was justification, charges serious enough to overcome the Templars' legal protections and popular support. So the Church began building a case. Dominican inquisitors were assigned to investigate Templar practices. Former Templars who had left the order, men with grievances, debts, or criminal pasts, were interviewed, encouraged to provide damaging testimony in exchange for money or legal immunity. Rumors that had circulated for decades were collected and given official credence. A narrative was constructed. The Templars weren't holy warriors at all, but secret heretics who'd been corrupted by their time in the East, who worshipped false idols, who denied Christ and engaged in obscene rituals. Most historians believe these charges were largely fabricated, manufactured to justify a persecution that was motivated by politics and greed rather than genuine religious concern. But buried within the accusations were hints of something real, distorted descriptions of actually Templar practices that, while not necessarily heretical, were certainly unorthodox. The charge that Templars denied Christ during initiation might have been a garbled reference to teachings about the difference between the historical Jesus and the theological Christ constructed by church councils. The accusation that they worshipped a head might refer to their reverence for ancient wisdom, the head being a metaphor for knowledge itself. Claims that they engaged in obscene kisses during ceremonies might be distorted descriptions of greeting rituals borrowed from Eastern Christian traditions or symbolic acts whose meaning was lost on outside observers. But whether the specific accusations were true or not almost didn't matter. What mattered was that the Church had decided the Templars were too dangerous to exist. They possessed knowledge from Solomon's Temple, knowledge about ancient technologies, alternative spiritual practices, and possibly evidence that challenged official church history. They had demonstrated independence that suggested they didn't truly accept papal authority as absolute, and they had resources that made them powerful enough to resist if they decided to reveal what they knew. By 1307, the decision had been made at the highest levels of both church and crown. The Knights Templar would be destroyed. Not disbanded or reformed, but utterly eliminated. Their members arrested, their property confiscated, their secrets extracted through torture and then suppressed forever. It would be one of the most efficient and brutal persecutions in medieval history, designed to ensure that whatever the Templars had found beneath Solomon's Temple would never threaten church authority again. The plan was set, the date was chosen, and the Templars, despite their wealth and power, despite their secret knowledge and hidden artifacts, had no idea what was coming. They had grown comfortable, confident in their privileges and protection. They believed themselves untouchable. They were about to discover how quickly power could turn against those who possessed knowledge that threatened it, how brutally institutional authority would act when it decided that secrets were too dangerous to be allowed to survive. The countdown had begun, and when it ended, on a Friday that would become legendary for misfortune, the Templars would learn that knowing too much was the most dangerous thing you could do in medieval Europe. The only question was whether their secrets would die with them, or whether they had prepared for this possibility, hidden their most important discoveries in places the Church would never find them, and created a legacy that would survive long after the last Templar knight drew his final breath.
October 13th, 1307. A Friday.
The date would become synonymous with bad luck, entering folklore as the unluckiest day on the calendar. But for the Knights Templar, it was something far worse than mere misfortune. It was the day nearly 2 centuries of power, wealth, and secret knowledge came crashing down in a coordinated strike that still stands as one of the most efficient persecutions in medieval history. The operation began at dawn. Across France, in every major city and remote commandery, royal soldiers moved simultaneously. They carried sealed orders from King Philip IV, orders that had been distributed days earlier with strict instructions not to be opened until the morning of October 13th. The coordination was remarkable for the medieval period. This wasn't a gradual crackdown, but a synchronized nationwide arrest operation that caught the Templars almost completely by surprise. In Paris, soldiers surrounded the Temple, the massive Templar fortress that served as their headquarters and treasury. Grand Master Jacques de Molay, who had arrived in France just months earlier from Cyprus, was awakened and placed under arrest. In commanderies from Normandy to Provence, Templar knights were seized in their beds, given no chance to resist or flee. Within hours, virtually every Templar in France, estimates suggest between 2,000 and 5,000 men, was in royal custody. The charges read against them were shocking. The arrest warrant, drafted by King Philip IV's lawyers and approved by Pope Clement V, accused the Templars of the most serious heresies imaginable. They were charged with denying Christ, spitting on the cross during secret initiation ceremonies, worshipping an idol called Baphomet, engaging in obscene sexual practices, and conducting rituals that perverted the holy sacraments. These weren't minor accusations of financial impropriety or military incompetence. These were charges of fundamental apostasy, of abandoning Christianity itself for demonic worship. In medieval law, such charges carried the death penalty and, more importantly, justified the complete confiscation of all Templar property. Everything they owned would pass to the crown. But here's what makes October 13th so suspicious. The operation was too well planned, too perfectly executed to be a response to suddenly discovered heresy. This wasn't righteous outrage prompting immediate action. This was a carefully orchestrated political and economic seizure that had been planned for months, possibly years. The charges of heresy were the justification, not the motivation. King Philip IV was bankrupt. He owed the Templars enormous sums he could never repay. His previous attempts to raise money, expelling the Jews, debasing the currency, heavy taxation, had made him deeply unpopular. But if he could prove the Templars were heretics, he could legally seize all their wealth, eliminate his debts, and appeared to be defending the faith rather than committing robbery. It was the perfect solution to his financial crisis, as long as he could make the heresy charges stick. For this, he needed confessions, and the methods used to obtain them revealed the true nature of the persecution. The Templars were turned over to Dominican inquisitors, men trained in the extraction of confessions through torture. The techniques were systematic and horrifying. Sleep deprivation, keeping prisoners awake for days until they would confess to anything just to be allowed to rest. Starvation and extreme thirst. The rack, which stretched bodies until joints dislocated. The strappado, which suspended prisoners by their wrists tied behind their backs, dislocating shoulders. Burning feet with hot irons, and in the most extreme cases, the removal of fingernails and toenails, the crushing of feet and hands, and other tortures too graphic to detail. Under such treatment, men will confess to anything. And the Templars confessed. Some admitted to denying Christ. Others described spitting on the cross. Many spoke of worshiping a mysterious head or idol. They described initiation ceremonies that included blasphemous acts and obscene rituals.
The confessions varied in details, but were consistent enough in their broad themes to provide the appearance of truth. But here's the critical question. Were these confessions entirely fabricated under torture, or did they contain kernels of truth, distorted descriptions of actual Templar practices that, while not heretical, were certainly unorthodox? Some historians argue that the charges were pure invention, that no truth lay behind them at all. The Templars were Orthodox Christians who were simply victims of royal greed and political manipulation. The confessions were false, extracted through unbearable pain, and should be given no credence whatsoever.
But other scholars note troubling consistencies. Across dozens of interrogations conducted by different inquisitors in different locations, certain details keep appearing. The mysterious head that was worshipped, references to secret knowledge passed from the original founders, descriptions of initiation ceremonies that tested faith by requiring symbolic acts of denial, mention of a higher truth that transcended normal Christian teaching. Could all of this be coincidence? Could torture alone produce such consistent themes across so many testimonies? Or is it more likely that the Templars did practice something unorthodox, rituals based on knowledge they discovered beneath Solomon's temple, teachings that suggested Christianity was part of a larger spiritual truth rather than the only path to salvation? Consider the charge of denying Christ. In the context of Templar theology, this might not mean rejecting Jesus' divinity, but rather distinguishing between the historical Jesus and the theological construct created by church councils. If the Templars had found documents from the 1st century describing Jesus' actual teachings, perhaps emphasizing direct spiritual experience over institutional mediation, perhaps presenting his mission differently than the canonical Gospels, they might have developed an understanding of Christianity that, while not denying Jesus' importance, didn't accept every detail of church doctrine. The mysterious head they allegedly worshipped could have been exactly what some testimonies claimed: a reliquary containing a skull, perhaps even one they believed belonged to John the Baptist or another important figure. Or it could have been symbolic, representing wisdom, gnosis, the head of truth that stood above all religious traditions. The Knights of the Round Table sought the Holy Grail. Perhaps the Templars sought something similar, not a physical cup, but enlightenment itself, direct knowledge of divine truth. The accusations of obscene kisses and sexual impropriety might have been garbled descriptions of greeting rituals borrowed from Eastern Christian traditions, or symbolic acts whose meaning was lost on outside observers. Coptic and Syrian Christians had practices that seemed strange to Western Europeans. If the Templars had incorporated such elements into their ceremonies based on texts they'd found in Jerusalem, inquisitors unfamiliar with these traditions might interpret them as sexual perversion. Grand Master Jacques de Molay himself confessed under torture, admitting to denying Christ and spitting on the cross. But later, when brought before papal commissioners, he recanted, stating that he had only confessed to save himself from further torture. This pattern repeated across many testimonies: confessions extracted through pain, followed by recantations when prisoners believed they might receive fair treatment. The recantations were a problem for Philip. If the Templars denied their confessions, the legal justification for their persecution collapsed. So he did something that revealed his true motives. He had 54 Templars burned at the stake in Paris as relapsed heretics. Men who had confessed and then recanted were, by inquisitorial law, subject to immediate execution. The message was clear: confess and maintain your confession, or die.
Faced with this choice, most Templars maintained their confessions. What choice did they have? Recantation meant death by fire. At least by confirming their confessions, they might eventually be released or given lighter sentences. So the testimonies stood, creating an official record of Templar heresy that justified their persecution. But Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, did something extraordinary. In March 1314, after 7 years of imprisonment, he was brought before a large crowd in front of Notre Dame Cathedral for a public ceremony where he was expected to confirm his confession one final time before being sentenced to life imprisonment. Instead, standing before thousands of witnesses, he loudly proclaimed his innocence and that of the entire Templar order. He stated that his confessions were false, extracted through torture, and that the charges against the Templars were lies designed to steal their property.
King Philip, watching from a nearby building, was furious. That same evening, without waiting for church approval, he had Jacques de Molay and another high-ranking Templar, Geoffrey de Charny, burned at the stake on an island in the Seine River. As the flames rose, legend says de Molay issued a curse, summoning both King Philip and Pope Clement to meet him before God's judgment within a year. Remarkably, both men were dead within months, Clement in April 1314, Philip in November of the same year. The legend of the Templar curse spread quickly, adding to the mystique and mystery surrounding the order. But what it really demonstrated was how threatened the authorities felt by even the possibility that Templar secrets might be revealed. De Molay had to die immediately before he could say more, before he could explain what the Templars had really found beneath Solomon's temple, before he could reveal the knowledge that had made them so powerful and so dangerous. The persecution spread beyond France. Pope Clement, under pressure from Philip, issued bulls ordering all Christian rulers to arrest Templars in their territories. The response varied. Some kingdoms acted quickly, others moved slowly or reluctantly. In England, the Templars were arrested but treated relatively leniently, with most eventually released after token penances. In Spain and Portugal, many Templars simply joined other military orders, particularly the Order of Christ in Portugal, which essentially continued Templar traditions under a new name. But the systematic destruction in France was effective. The order's leadership was dead or imprisoned. Their properties were confiscated. Their financial records were seized and destroyed. And, most importantly, whatever artifacts and documents they'd brought back from Jerusalem were taken into custody, either claimed by the French crown, turned over to the Vatican, or hidden so effectively that they've never been found. Or were they? Because here's where the story gets even more intriguing. There's evidence that the Templars knew the persecution was coming. Rumors of planned action against them had been circulating for months. Some Templars fled before October 13th. The Templar fleet, reportedly docked at La Rochelle on the Atlantic coast, disappeared just before the arrests. Ships, sailors, and cargo all vanishing without trace. Where did they go? What were they carrying? Some historians suggest the fleet sailed to Scotland, which was at war with England and not subject to papal bulls ordering Templar arrests. Others propose Portugal, where the Order of Christ would provide safe haven. More exotic theories suggest they crossed the Atlantic, reaching the Americas nearly 2 centuries before Columbus, carrying their treasures to a new world where they could preserve them safely. Whether or not these escape stories are true, one thing is certain. Not all Templar knowledge was captured. Not all their secrets were extracted through torture. And the artifacts and documents they'd brought back from Jerusalem weren't all accounted for in the royal seizures. Some of it survived, hidden by Templars who saw the persecution coming and made preparations. The question that has haunted historians for 7 centuries is, where? Where did the survivors hide the most important discoveries? And what happened to the knowledge that made the Templars simultaneously the most powerful and most persecuted organization in medieval Europe. Because the story doesn't end with the burnings of 1314. The Templar legacy survived, transformed, passed through secret channels to inheritors who would preserve it through the centuries. The knowledge from Solomon's Temple didn't die with Jacques de Molay. It went underground, waiting for a time when it could be revealed without triggering the same violent suppression. That time may have finally come, and the secrets the Church tried so desperately to destroy might be closer to revelation than anyone suspects.
The execution of Jacques de Molay should have been the end. The Grand Master burned to death, the order officially dissolved, its wealth confiscated, its members scattered or dead. By every measure, the persecution had succeeded. The Knights Templar, as an organized force, ceased to exist. But knowledge doesn't burn as easily as flesh, and secrets protected across 2 centuries don't simply vanish because the men who carried them are killed. The question that has obsessed historians, treasure hunters, and conspiracy theorists for 700 years is simple. What happened to what the Templars found beneath Solomon's Temple? The official inventories of confiscated Templar property are remarkably disappointing. Yes, the French crown seized estates, fortresses, gold, and silver, but nothing that would explain the Templars' legendary wealth. No ancient artifacts from Jerusalem, no mysterious scrolls or forbidden texts, no objects that would justify the extraordinary privileges the Church had granted them, or the desperate fury with which Philip destroyed them. This absence is suspicious. Either the Templars weren't as wealthy as legend suggests, which contradicts every contemporary account, or the most valuable items were never in the inventories because they'd been hidden before the arrests. The evidence strongly suggests the latter. Multiple sources describe unusual Templar activity in the months before October 1307, shipments of unspecified cargo moving at night, crates being loaded onto ships at La Rochelle, wagons departing the Paris Temple under heavy guard heading to destinations unknown. The behavior of an organization that knew persecution was imminent and was taking steps to preserve its most important assets. So where did it all go? The theories are numerous, and some are more credible than others, but certain locations keep appearing in the historical record. Places where Templar connections ran deep and where the order's secrets might have found sanctuary. Scotland is perhaps the most compelling possibility. In 1307, Scotland was at war with England, and Robert the Bruce, fighting for Scottish independence, had been excommunicated by the Pope. This made Scotland effectively outside papal jurisdiction. Templar refugees fleeing persecution would have found a kingdom that had every reason to welcome them and ignore church demands for their arrest. There's intriguing evidence of Templar presence in Scotland. The famous Roslin Chapel, built in the mid-15th century by William Sinclair, is covered in Templar symbolism. Its architecture incorporates the same sacred geometry found in Templar constructions. Its stone carvings include Templar crosses, mysterious symbols, and most remarkably, depictions of plants from the Americas, carved decades before Columbus's voyage. How did a Scottish chapel built in the 1440s contain accurate representations of New World corn and aloe vera? The answer might lie in Templar voyages across the Atlantic, carrying their knowledge and treasures to the Americas, establishing settlements that predated official European discovery by nearly a century. It sounds fantastic, until you remember that the Templars possessed ancient navigational texts that might have described Atlantic currents and distant lands, knowledge preserved from Phoenician or even earlier seafaring civilizations. But Scotland and the Americas aren't the only possibilities. Portugal offers perhaps the most direct continuity of Templar tradition.
When Pope Clement ordered the dissolution of the Knights Templar, King Dinas of Portugal simply renamed them. In 1319, the Order of Christ was established, incorporating former Templars and continuing their mission under a new name. The Order of Christ wore a modified version of the Templar cross, red with white edges rather than red on white, but otherwise maintained the same structure, rituals, and traditions. And here's where it gets fascinating. The Order of Christ financed the Portuguese Age of Discovery. Prince Henry the Navigator was Grand Master of the Order. The ships that explored Africa's coast, that rounded the Cape of Good Hope, that eventually reached India, they all sailed under the Red Cross of the Order of Christ, the direct descendant of the Knights Templar.
Were these voyages simply about trade and exploration, or were they searching for something, following maps and information inherited from the Templars, seeking sites described in ancient texts recovered from beneath Solomon's Temple? Some researchers have suggested that Portuguese navigators had access to extremely accurate maps that predated their official voyages, maps showing coastlines that European civilization supposedly didn't know existed. Where would such maps come from, if not from ancient sources preserved in Templar archives? Then there's Rennes-le-Château in southern France, site of one of history's most enduring mysteries. In the 1890s, a poor parish priest named Berenger Saunier suddenly became extremely wealthy after conducting renovations in his church. He claimed to have found ancient parchments hidden in a hollow pillar, parchments that led him to discover something that made him rich and, according to some accounts, gave him leverage over the Vatican itself. What did Saunier find? The area around Rennes-le-Château was Templar territory. The local landscape is dotted with ruined Templar commanderies. If the Templars had hidden documents or treasures in the region before the persecution, Saunier might have stumbled upon them 7 centuries later. The parchments he reportedly found contained coded messages, geometric puzzles, and references to treasure and secrets. Whatever he discovered, it was significant enough that he was visited by important church officials, received mysterious payments from unknown sources, and lived in luxury until his death, while maintaining absolute silence about the source of his wealth. But perhaps the most significant repository of Templar secrets lies in the most obvious place, the Vatican itself. When the Templars were arrested, many of their documents were confiscated by church authorities and transported to Rome. What happened to them? Official records suggest they were examined and then destroyed or sealed in archives. But the Vatican's secret archives, now known as the Vatican Apostolic Archives, contain an estimated 85 kilometers of shelving holding documents spanning 2 millennia of church history. Hidden somewhere in those vast collections might be the Templar documents describing what they found beneath Solomon's Temple. Texts in Hebrew, Greek, and languages no one could identify. Scrolls detailing ancient technologies and spiritual practices. Perhaps even evidence that would fundamentally challenge church doctrine, which would explain why the Vatican would want them sealed away rather than destroyed. Because destroying evidence is risky. Someone might have copies, but sealing it in archives where only the most trusted researchers ever gain access? That's control. There's a documented case that supports this theory. In 2001, historian Barbara Frail was granted rare access to Vatican archives and discovered the Chenon parchment, a document from 1308 showing that Pope Clement V had actually absolved the Templars of heresy charges, but kept this secret, allowing the persecution to continue for political reasons. If this document survived, what else might be hidden in the Vatican's collections? What other secrets about the Templars has the Church preserved but never revealed? Beyond these physical locations, there's another form of preservation, the transmission of knowledge through secret societies. Freemasonry has long claimed connections to the Knights Templar.
While modern Freemasonry's direct historical links to the medieval Templars are debated, there are undeniable parallels. The emphasis on sacred geometry and architectural knowledge, the use of esoteric symbolism, the organization into degrees of initiation with secrets revealed progressively, the reverence for Solomon's Temple as the spiritual center of their tradition. Many Masonic lodges explicitly reference Templar origins, and the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry includes a King Templar degree. Could this represent genuine continuity, knowledge passed from Templar survivors to early Masonic lodges preserved through centuries of secrecy? The rituals and symbols suggest that even if direct organizational continuity is uncertain, philosophical and spiritual traditions from the Templars influence the development of Freemasonry.
And it's not just Freemasonry. The Rosicrucians, another esoteric society that emerged in the 17th century, claimed knowledge of ancient mysteries and alchemical secrets. Their manifestos referenced hidden wisdom preserved from ancient times, waiting to be revealed when humanity was ready. Were they inheritors of Templar knowledge, presenting it under a new name and in a new form appropriate to their era? The pattern that emerges is one of transformation rather than destruction. The Knights Templar as a visible, unified organization were indeed destroyed in the 14th century, but the knowledge they possessed, the discoveries from beneath Solomon's Temple, the ancient texts and artifacts, the spiritual practices and technical information didn't disappear. It went underground, fragmenting into multiple streams of transmission that preserved different aspects of the whole. Some of it became esoteric knowledge passed through secret societies. Some of it was hidden in physical locations, waiting to be rediscovered. Some of it influenced the development of Renaissance thought as scholars gained access to ancient texts and began questioning medieval orthodoxy. The Protestant Reformation's challenge to church authority, the scientific revolution's emphasis on direct observation over received tradition, even the Enlightenment's focus on reason and individual rights, all of these movements, in different ways, embodied principles that the Templars had encountered in their ancient sources. The truth could be discovered independently of institutional authority, that divine wisdom wasn't monopolized by any single religion, that human beings possessed greater potential than medieval theology acknowledged. This is why the Templar legacy matters. It's not primarily about gold and treasure, though those make for exciting stories. It's about knowledge, about a moment in history when an organization accessed information that challenged the dominant paradigm, that suggested human civilization was older, more sophisticated, and more spiritually diverse than official history claimed. The Templars proved that such knowledge could make an organization extraordinarily successful, giving them practical advantages in architecture, finance, and organization. But they also proved that knowledge threatening to institutional power will be violently suppressed. The Church and Crown couldn't allow an organization to possess information that challenged their authority, so they destroyed the visible structure while the invisible essence survived in transformed states. Today, 7 centuries after the last Templar Grand Master died proclaiming his innocence, we're still uncovering pieces of what they found. Archaeological excavations beneath the Temple Mount, when politics allows them, continue to reveal ancient chambers and artifacts. Medieval documents emerge from archives, providing new details about Templar activities. Modern technology allows us to analyze Templar constructions and realize they incorporated mathematical knowledge that shouldn't have been available in the 12th century. And perhaps most significantly, we're developing a more sophisticated understanding of ancient civilizations, recognizing that cultures like Egypt, Babylon, and pre-Columbian America possessed knowledge and capabilities that previous generations of scholars dismissed as impossible. We're discovering that the ancient world was more connected, more technically advanced, more spiritually sophisticated than we thought.
which makes it more plausible that Solomon's temple really did contain preserved wisdom from earlier civilizations, and that the Templars really did find it. The question isn't whether the Templars discovered something beneath Solomon's temple. The evidence, their rapid rise to power, their architectural and financial innovations, their unorthodox practices, the church's desperate persecution, makes it clear they found something significant. The question is whether we're ready to accept what that discovery implies about human history, about the origins of religious traditions, about knowledge that has been suppressed for millennia because it threatens the power structures built on controlled ignorance. The secrets aren't fully revealed yet, but they're closer to the surface than ever before. And when they finally emerge completely, when the last hidden caches are found and the full scope of what the Templars discovered becomes clear, it will challenge everything we think we know about our past and everything we assume about our future.
We began this journey standing at the threshold of a mystery. 9 knights disappearing into darkness beneath Solomon's temple, emerging 9 years later with something that would transform them from obscure warriors into the most powerful organization in Christendom. Now, having followed the trail of evidence through centuries of secrecy, persecution, and hidden knowledge, we arrive at the most profound question of all. What if they really did find it? What if everything we've explored, the ancient wisdom, the suppressed texts, the artifacts of impossible sophistication, what if it's all true? The implications are staggering, because if the Knights Templar discovered evidence beneath Solomon's temple that challenged the foundations of medieval Christianity, that evidence still exists somewhere, hidden in Vatican archives, buried in locations known only to secret societies, encoded in the architecture of cathedrals and the symbols of esoteric traditions. Waiting. Waiting for what? For us to be ready to accept it, for humanity to reach a point where we can handle truths that shattered the certainties of medieval Europe, for a moment when revealing hidden knowledge won't trigger the same violent suppression that destroyed the Templars 7 centuries ago. Consider what we've learned. Solomon's temple wasn't simply a beautiful building for worship. It was a structure built according to precise mathematical principles that encoded knowledge of harmonic ratios, astronomical cycles, and sacred geometry. The ancients understood these principles not as abstract mathematics, but as practical science, as technology for manipulating energy and consciousness in ways our modern civilization is only beginning to rediscover. The temple served as more than a religious center. It was a repository, a vault, where the accumulated wisdom of civilizations predating Israel was preserved. When the Babylonians and Romans destroyed the visible structure, the essential knowledge survived in sealed chambers, protected beneath tons of rubble and guarded by silence that stretched across centuries. The Templars found those chambers. They accessed texts describing technologies and spiritual practices from cultures so ancient that even their names have been lost to history. They recovered artifacts whose function demonstrated that what we call magic or miracles in ancient accounts might have been practical applications of principles we're only now beginning to rediscover. Quantum physics, consciousness studies, energy medicine, the connections between mind and matter. Most dangerous of all, they found evidence about the true nature of Jesus' ministry. Not the sanitized version that medieval Christianity taught, but something more complex, more challenging, more transformative. Evidence that Jesus was teaching ancient wisdom practices, methods for direct spiritual experience that didn't require institutional mediation. Evidence that early Christianity was far more diverse than the official church history admits. that alternative interpretations were suppressed not because they were false, but because they threatened clerical authority. This is why the Templars had to be destroyed, not because they were heretics who worshiped demons, but because they possessed proof that the religious narrative upon which medieval power structures were built was incomplete at best, deliberately misleading at worst. They demonstrated that ancient wisdom could provide practical advantages in engineering, finance, organization, and consciousness itself, that those who possessed it gave leverage over those who relied on faith and tradition alone. The persecution succeeded in destroying their visible organization, but it failed to eliminate the knowledge, because knowledge, once discovered, wants to be shared. It finds channels of transmission. It survives in fragments, passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, waiting for conditions that allow its safe emergence.
We see this throughout history. The Renaissance rediscovery of classical learning wasn't random. It was the surfacing of knowledge that had been preserved through the medieval period by networks connected to the Templar legacy. The scientific revolution's challenge to religious authority echoed the Templar insight that direct observation revealed truths institutions wanted hidden. The Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and individual rights reflected the ancient understanding that human beings possessed inherent dignity and capability beyond what hierarchical structures acknowledged. Each of these movements faced resistance. Scientists were persecuted, philosophers were censored, reformers were burned, because institutional power always resists knowledge that threatens its foundations. The Church learned this with the Templars, that permitting an organization to possess suppressed knowledge, even under the supposed control of privileges and oversight, was too dangerous. Knowledge creates independence. Independence challenges authority. Therefore, knowledge must be controlled, or those who possess it must be eliminated. But we live in a different world now. The Church no longer has the power to burn heretics or suppress discoveries through force. Information moves too quickly, across too many channels for any single institution to control. Ancient sites continued to be excavated, revealing evidence of sophisticated civilizations that predated known history. Technologies once dismissed as impossible, like the precision of megalithic construction or the advanced metallurgy of ancient cultures, are being recognized as genuine achievements that challenge our assumptions about the capabilities of our ancestors. And the spiritual landscape has transformed. The absolute authority of single religious institutions has fractured. People explore diverse traditions, recognizing that wisdom appears in many forms across cultures and centuries. The idea that ancient practices might offer valid insights, meditation, energy work, direct spiritual experience is no longer dismissed as primitive superstition, but increasingly validated by scientific research into consciousness and human potential. In other words, we might finally be approaching the moment when Templar secrets can be revealed without triggering the same violent suppression, when evidence that challenges official narratives can be examined openly rather than buried under threats of heresy, when knowledge preserved for centuries in hidden form can emerge into daylight. But here's the crucial question: do we actually want this? Are we truly ready for our certainties to be challenged? For our understanding of history to be fundamentally revised? For proof that ancient civilizations possessed capabilities we've assumed were impossible? Because accepting Templar discoveries as genuine means accepting several uncomfortable implications. It means acknowledging that much of what we've been taught about ancient history is incomplete or incorrect. It means recognizing that religious institutions suppressed knowledge to maintain power, rather than to protect spiritual truth. It means admitting that our modern civilization, for all its technological sophistication, may have lost understandings that ancient cultures possessed,
understandings about consciousness, energy, the nature of reality itself. Most challenging of all, it means accepting that we're not the pinnacle of human development, that we're actually recovering from a collapse, piecing together knowledge that was once more complete, but was lost during periods of catastrophe and deliberate suppression. This is difficult for modern pride to accept. We prefer to imagine continuous progress, humanity climbing steadily from primitive beginnings to enlightened present. The alternative, that we're rediscovering what was known before, that ancient wisdom was suppressed rather than surpassed, challenges fundamental assumptions about history and progress. Yet the evidence increasingly points in this direction. The Templars' success suggests they accessed genuine ancient knowledge. Their persecution demonstrates how threatening such knowledge was to established power. And their legacy, the fragments preserved through secret societies, the influences visible in Renaissance art and architecture, and the continuing mystery surrounding their discoveries, indicates that what they found was too important to be permanently suppressed.
So where does this leave us? Standing, as the Templars once stood, at the threshold of chambers containing dangerous knowledge. We can choose to seal those chambers again, to accept comfortable narratives and avoid uncomfortable questions. Or we can choose to descend into the darkness, to excavate the truth, even if it challenges everything we thought we knew. The choice isn't simple. Knowledge brings responsibility. If the Templars really did discover evidence of advanced ancient technologies, of spiritual practices for expanding consciousness, of alternative histories that challenge institutional narratives, what do we do with such information? How do we integrate it into modern understanding without triggering social upheaval? How do we benefit from ancient wisdom without repeating the mistakes that led to its suppression in the first place? These aren't merely academic questions. They're live issues as archaeology continues to uncover anomalous artifacts, as researchers identify sophisticated ancient technologies, as spiritual practices from diverse traditions demonstrate measurable effects on consciousness and well-being. The knowledge is emerging, whether we're ready or not. Perhaps that's the real legacy of the Knights Templar, not the specific artifacts or texts they found, but the example they set. They demonstrated that courage to seek truth, even dangerous truth, can transform individuals and organizations. They showed that ancient wisdom, properly applied, provides genuine advantages. And they proved that knowledge, once discovered, cannot be permanently suppressed. It survives, adapts, and eventually emerges when conditions permit. The chambers beneath Solomon's temple have been sealed for centuries. The Templar archives remain hidden in locations we can only speculate about. The Vatican's secret collections stay locked behind restrictions that few scholars ever penetrate. But the knowledge itself, the essential insights about human history, spiritual practice, and ancient capabilities, that knowledge is leaking out through multiple channels, reassembling itself in the minds of researchers, archaeologists, and seekers who follow the trail of evidence wherever it leads. We stand at a threshold. Behind us lies the comfortable certainty of official narratives, the safety of not questioning too deeply, the ease of accepting what authorities tell us about our past and our potential. Ahead lies the uncertain territory the Templars entered when they descended beneath the temple, a place where answers raise more questions, where evidence challenges assumptions, where truth demands we abandon comforting illusions. The Templars made their choice. They sought, they found, and they paid the price for possessing knowledge that threatened power. But they also demonstrated that such knowledge exists, that it can be recovered, and that it transforms those who possess it. Now, the choice is ours. Do we have the courage to follow where their excavations led? Do we possess the wisdom to handle what they discovered?
Are we ready, truly ready, for the secrets that lie buried beneath Jerusalem, hidden in archives, preserved through centuries of secrecy, waiting for the moment when humanity can finally face the truth about who we are, where we came from, and what we're capable of becoming? The stones beneath the Temple Mount still hold their whispers. The sealed chambers remain, protected by rubble and politics and institutional fear. But eventually, perhaps soon, perhaps in our lifetime, those chambers will be fully excavated. The Vatican archives will be opened. The hidden caches will be discovered. The fragments preserved through secret societies will be reassembled into coherent wholes. And when that moment comes, when the final secrets of Solomon's Temple are revealed, we'll discover whether the Knights Templar died protecting humanity from knowledge we weren't ready to handle, or whether they died trying to give us knowledge we desperately needed but couldn't yet accept. The mystery endures. The questions remain. And somewhere in the darkness beneath Jerusalem, beneath the Vatican, beneath layers of history and secrecy and deliberate forgetting, the truth waits. The only question is, are you ready to find it?